This is A New Angle, and I'm your host, Justin Angle, marketing professor at the University of Montana. This podcast is my chance to speak with cool people doing awesome things in and around the great state of Montana. We are proudly underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot. Hey folks, welcome back and thanks for tuning in. We are in a moment of massive disruption and emerging innovation in education. Though I recorded this particular conversation before the coronavirus pandemic, the timing of this episode seems particularly appropriate. Leslie and Mark Begert recently launched Fabulingua, a language learning app that mixes animated storytelling with simultaneous translation. The Fabulingua origin story is inspiring. The platform and its methodology are super engaging, and the scaling possibilities are really exciting. So let's get into it with Mark and Leslie Begert right now. Okay, so we're here today with Mark and Leslie Begert. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, excited to talk about your new business, Mark. We've talked about it on a couple occasions. Yeah. Leslie, we sort of just virtually met, so I'm excited to hear your story. The two of you have developed this language learning platform for kids through stories. And Leslie, this is born out of your upbringing, right? You grew up in Barcelona, multilingual family. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was a bilingual environment. It was English in the home and Spanish outside, everywhere else outside the home. And I lived there until I was about 13. I'd also spend summers in Venezuela with my Venezuelan family. And really, it was only when I then moved to the UK when I was 13. There I, eventually kind of took some French classes as a teenager, but I'd had this luck, I guess, in that I had spent my kindergarten year in a French school. So I'd had this exposure at a young age, which was kind of interesting to me because that kind of would come back and play into sort of various career opportunities that were available to me because of that. But I think the why, the how of what we're doing really kind of originates in my college years. I studied psychology and philosophy as an undergraduate at Oxford and then went on to do social anthropology at Cambridge. And during all those years, I would do lots of expeditions. Okay. And I often found myself as a simultaneous translator for the group. And so I developed this skill set that I didn't realize at the time would ever become useful again, where I spent hours and hours translating from Spanish into English. And it's like a bit of a muscle memory thing.
Sure.
Anyway, so fast forward, I've finished college, do a stint in banking, at Goldman, which is kind of really not for me, and then go and work at L'Oreal in marketing. And that's really the first time that I realized, the benefits of knowing an extra language, because I'd had that exposure in kindergarten to French. The French I did go on to study as a teenager and as a young adult, it landed very easily, very well. I had a good French accent. And so I was able to, they were able to give me extra French classes and pick it up well enough to do business in French. So that was my first experience. Then Mark and I met in London. We moved to Shanghai together. I followed him shortly after he went over there. And there I decided to sort of throw myself into learning Mandarin and had a really cool life experience of going to a fine arts school there for a number of years and specifically studying sculpture. So that was just a really unique opportunity to work with these amazing sculptors in Mandarin the whole time and learn so much. And then we took a year out, we went traveling, and we ended up in Argentina, bought some property there, and had a property business going out of Argentina for about 8 years. We didn't live there for all that time, but again, that was another language that I was using. So that by the time I was pregnant with my first child, I was like, wow, I've had all these different business and personal opportunities because of sort of these language skills. I'd really want to make sure that my kids had that opportunity.
And it seems it seems like these language skills that you developed, but you sort of developed both through sort of formal, traditional classroom experience, but also just through experiential learning. You're either in a community that's speaking it, or you're forced to be this translator to your colleagues. It seems like you're getting immersed in a bunch of different ways of learning language.
Totally. Absolutely. Yes, from formal kind of grammar lessons, kind of chained to my desk at school,
Right.
to just kind of got to wing it and make yourself understood. Absolutely. And really, it all contributes. The interesting thing is that despite all of these really great intentions, when I was pregnant with my older kid, I did not start off speaking Spanish to him.
Okay.
Really. Even though I really had thought about it long and hard and had a lot of debates in my head about whether I was going to do it. And it was only when he was 2.5 years old and I went to take him to Caracas to see my grandmother, that my cousin pulled me aside and she was like, Leslie, she now lives in Austin. It's kind of interesting. She was just like, Leslie, what are you doing? Like, I can't believe you're not speaking Spanish to him. You do realize you're depriving him of a huge gift, a huge opportunity. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're totally right. I'm totally dropping the ball.
Yeah, and so you needed one other thing to feel terrible about as a new parent, right?
Absolutely, exactly.
You're screwing up your child on so many dimensions. Let's just add another.
Exactly. So, so I came back kind of like fully armed with this idea that we were going to speak Spanish at home. Mark loves speaking Spanish. He'll talk to anyone in Spanish if they make themselves available to him. So we did that. But my son was not on board at all.
Okay. And how old was he at this point?
It's 2.5.
Okay.
They can be pretty vociferous.
Yep.
And eventually, he would just like have rallying cries like, no Spanish, and just be furious. And as you said, as a parent, you've just got so many battles to fight that eventually you choose them. And I was like, I'm not going to die on this hill. So, that's when I was like, okay, so it won't be our home language, but does that mean that the ship has sailed? My kid's never going to speak Spanish. And that's when I look back at my experience at that French kindergarten for a year. And I was like, hang on a minute. That gave me a massive leg up. And that was just 1 year at school. I wonder if I can do something, it'll still be something that, should he choose to use it later on, would give him an advantage. If that's where he wants to go.
Sure. So, and at this point, you're like, business is not on your radar at all. It's just, I want to make a better life for my child.
Yeah. Yes, this is totally for my kid.
Okay.
And so basically, I looked around a lot, and what I found at the time was pretty token, like, hey, learn your colors, learn your numbers. And I was like, yeah, well, what about after the colors and the numbers? There's a big gap between that and being able to speak a language, right? So I didn't find anything. So I was like, what else could I do? I was like, we're a big family of readers. I think like one of the most wonderful things about being a parent is you get to sit down with the person you most love in the world on your lap and dive into a beautiful illustrated children's book and spend time in this imaginary world together. So I was like, well, how about I do that, but like with bilingual books? So I started with some bilingual books, paragraph in Spanish on the left, paragraph in English on the right, on the other page. But that didn't work for us. He would basically kind of path of least resistance, totally ignore the Spanish and wait for me to get to the English page.
Okay.
And so then I was like, okay, I'm going to do Spanish only immersion. And that he was, again, super vociferous about. He's like, it was kind of tantamount to like, I don't know if you speak Russian. I don't. If somebody was to sit down and just read me a Russian book, he was not interested at the age of 2.5, So that's when the simultaneous translation muscle memory started to kick in. I was like, okay, so you're really frustrated that you don't understand what's going on in this book in Spanish. How about I do the simultaneous translation? To me, it was super natural because I've done it a million times. It's not necessarily natural to every Spanish speaker. Like it is, something you need to have practiced.
Sure.
And that turned out to be like the magic thing. And
are you talking like read one sentence in Spanish and then the same sentence in English? Like what, when you say simultaneous, how is it, what are the dynamics of that?
Right. So we had a Spanish only book, and I would read to him a phrase that that was maybe 3 or 4 words long, depending on the phrase. And it could be half of a sentence. And it would be something along the lines of, El perro se fue, the dog went a la playa, to the beach, y se encontró, and he met un tiburón, a shark.
Oh, you are really good at it.
So basically, by doing it that way, he was totally wrapped up in the story. And he was like, oh my God, what's going to happen to the dog and the shark? He did not care at all about how the story had got into his brain,
Sure.
which one of the languages. But interestingly enough, and then we developed a whole methodology where the second round, he'd copy how I said each one of those phrases. And then eventually he would quote unquote read that page because we'd read it so many times. But anyway, long and short is that I started doing this methodology for quite a little bit, quite a time for him. But it wasn't even like in my plan, in my mind, I was like, okay, this is cool. This is something I could do. I'm going to do it once a week for the rest of his life. Right. And I had this great plan of like the superstar parent I was going to be. And the reality again of parenting is that you have all these great plans and like most of them don't come true.
Right.
So this was one of the ones that I was like, it didn't happen every week. It happened a lot less frequently, I'd say probably once a month or so. But the interesting thing to me was that when he started little Spanish classes at his preschool, the level of the speed at which he learned was so much faster than his little friends who hadn't been read these Spanish stories.
Really? Okay.
So I was like, wow, I didn't even do it as much as I wanted to. Like really, I felt like I've totally failed. And yet it was really crazy effective for how little time I'd invested in it.
Huh.
Right.
Yeah.
And so interestingly came along when my daughter then came along, I was like, this is like crazy effective. I'm going to do this with her a lot more. So the second one gets the benefit. And then there was this one day, a couple years later, where I was doing this translation of this book in this way I'd done for by now many years with both my kids. And I had this moment. I was like, oh no, I have to stop doing it because I need to answer all these emails and I need to cook dinner and it's 5:00 and I need to do all of them.
Sure.
I need to clone myself. And in that moment, I was like, I can't clone my email writing, and I can't yet clone a meal. But this thing here, like this, there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to do technology shouldn't be able to do a large part of what I'm doing right now.
Right.
And that's really when I started looking. I was like, is there anyone out there that is teaching a second language through children's stories with this kind of methodology? And I looked and I couldn't find anything. So I waited for about 6 months for somebody to build it. To me, it seemed kind of like, I don't know, an obvious thing for somebody to build, and no one did it. So eventually, I just thought, well, if no one else is going to build it, maybe I need to. So
yeah, I'm trying to think. Like we've got, traditional in-school learning, which seems really just rigid and formal, and we can get into that. But it also seems like the only sort of private competitors I've thought of are like the classic Rosetta Stone type of thing for an adult, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I'll jump in here. When Leslie came to this sort of revelation and had done some market research around the alternatives or solutions that were similar to the methodology that she'd been using or developing with our kids, we did a pretty deep dive into the market and looking what was available out there. And yes, there are and have been a lot of traditional language learning programs. You mentioned Rosetta Stone. There's been Berlitz, that's been around forever.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there are language tutors. There's night school. There's all sorts of things that exist really for adults. For children, the alternatives are less and less, particularly in the United States. A school either subscribes to language learning as being something important and therefore makes it a part, but less and less that's the case. And particularly in public schools, you won't see language learning until it's an elective in the 6th or 7th grade. And of course, the way it's taught is something you alluded to earlier. It's very much a grammar focused introduction, which has a lot of rote memorization associated with it.
Right.
I'm sure you recall conjugating verbs and things like that.
Oh, yeah. I'm having all kinds of flashbacks during this conversation. I learned German in high school, and it was rough. It's
breaking rocks. It really is. That's how I was taught. Here in Texas, believe it or not, where there's a whole lot of Spanish spoken, in public schools, it's not. It's typically not introduced until 6th grade elective, and it's hard work, and of course that's an awkward age to be put into a position where you have to get up in front of a class sometimes and speak extemporaneously in a foreign language that you really don't understand at all and don't have any sort of foundation in. So, right. Yeah, that's a big problem. And the other really critical thing that you're missing by introducing the language, at that age, is that there's this sort of magical window of cognitive development between the age of 0 and some say 8, 9, 10, where our brains are actively wiring to all of the language input around us. And that is an opportunity to acquire a language cognitively, vis-a-vis waiting a bit longer when we have to, quote unquote, learn that particular language from a rules-based approach. So, this was all a part of the research we did when we dove into whether or not this had the legs, the market, the opportunity, the differentiation to be a company that could have a big impact.
Yeah, as you're laying that out there, Mark, I'm thinking, Leslie, you kind of grokked this method of teaching your son, yet at the same time, like thinking about it as a business opportunity, you start to get into the research on learning and realize that actually this method aligns with not only the age, sort of age-appropriate learning mechanisms, but also methodologically, like it aligns with how we learn, right?
Yeah, I mean, the really fascinating thing is, as you said, as we started doing this research, so one of the first things we did actually after doing some customer research was to go through the process of taking out a patent on the methodology. And the interesting thing, I don't know if you've ever taken one out, but it's kind of like writing an academic paper, right? You have to sit down and comb through reams and reams of academic research that's been done before to say, how am I different? And in the process of that, that's when we found out about all the academic research that had been done in second language acquisition. And basically the big new understanding in second language acquisition is that the single most important thing is in terms of the successful second language acquisition isn't sitting down and learning rules, as Mark was talking about, and memorizing things. It is, in actual fact, the amount of input that goes into your brain. So long as that input is comprehensible, which means that you roughly have an understanding of what it's about. So long as the input meets that criteria, more input, more learning, right? So really what you want to do is create an exposure program with as much comprehensible input as possible. And after that, your brain is really good at wiring to figure out the rules that tend to emerge from all of that exposure, right? So it was just really fascinating. I was like, oh, and I didn't realize that this is what I was doing. I was creating this exposure program.
But one of the key aspects, that goes along with this, the comprehensible input factor theory, is that to be most effective, it needs to be in a low stress, low anxiety environment.
Right.
There's the sort of preeminent sort of thinker, thought leader, an academic behind second language acquisition is a professor at USC called Stephen Krashen, who wrote Theory of Second Language Acquisition. And two of his primary, sort of hypotheses behind this theory is that one, maximize comprehensible input, and two, do so in a low stress, low anxiety environment, because if an effective filter is raised in the learning process, then the ability to learn that language, to acquire that language, is mitigated. So that's where our stories and the engagement and the fun associated with it, and meeting the child in that sort of medium and environment is really helpful.
Yeah, I found that super interesting. That he basically was saying, look, for all learning, low stress is good, right? Low anxiety. Right. But he said, at the I've sort of heard discussions that at the margins, maybe a little bit of stress can be good in a couple subjects. I don't know specifically which ones that kind of can give you that kind of extra oomph to get over the line to learn something. But he said, for language learning, it is literally always totally counterproductive. This affective filter, which he called it, goes up in the brain and stops you literally learning any new language if there's any degree of stress, which then goes back to the experience you had as a teenager of standing in class and being forced to speak extemporaneously and in this really high stress environment. You're really not learning. Your brain's incapable of learning all that much.
Oh yeah, I can just all the layers of stress. It's like getting up in front of people, and then the dynamics of trying to express an idea, and then express it in a foreign language. It's just so many layers of stress, particularly for a sixth grader, like you said, Mark. That's not a time of your life where getting up in front of a group is the thing you're begging to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, look, learning grammar rules are part of any language. We learn that in English as native English speakers at some point. But, we will have had somewhere between 6 and 10 years of being immersed in that particular language and having a very strong foundation in that language before we begin to learn sort of the grammatical rules associated with that language. Yet with foreign languages, that's where we start.
Yeah, it's so odd. I mean, I think about it. I have a friend that, a colleague here who does research on how children learn to tell time. And if you think of like a watch or a clock, it's a very complicated way of communicating information. I mean, time is complicated as a concept, and then you think about how we communicate it with these 3 hands on a clock.
Yeah.
But children sort of just pick it up and gain fluency with this thing with really no explicit idea of the rules, right? They're not being taught the rules. They're just sort of, well, this is seconds and this is hours. And over a period of exposure, they get it. Same thing. It seems like some of those rules hold with language as well.
Well, I mean, I always use the example as if you can imagine when you were first fed by your mother or father, and you're sitting there in that high chair, and again and again and again, you're saying, they're holding the spoon out and saying, eat the carrots. You want the carrots, or have your juice, or drink your water. Eventually over time you go, okay, that thing that she keeps handing over here. That she's saying that word water, that must be water, right?
Yeah, build those associations. Yeah,
exactly.
So I guess back to sort of the timeline here, Leslie, both of you are starting to do research on, hey, is there anybody else out there in the marketplace doing this? Seeing that there is not, you're also realizing that technology is a way that you could deliver this product to a scalable market, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I'd like to sort of speak to that briefly. I think we talked about the traditional solutions that were out there, and when we did our sort of customer discovery research project, where we sat down with around 40 different families across Austin and essentially had a, ethnographic sort of research study of these parents, these families who had a keen interest in having their kids learn a second language.
A New Angle is brought to you by First Security Bank and Blackfoot, 2 cool companies doing awesome things all over Montana.
Hi, this is Mike Morelli, Director of the Entertainment Management Program at the University of Montana, and you are listening to A New Angle.
To a family, we found that one of the bigger challenges to language learning for their children was that it wasn't particularly accessible. In other words, it was fairly inconvenient, and there was a pretty significant cost to it. And that they couldn't really, they didn't understand or feel that it was, effectively and efficiently developing language skills for the kids.
Okay.
And the type of, and there are all sorts of, it's a very fragmented market. We mentioned all the different ways earlier that adults learn. Same thing with kids. With kids, it's typically a little bit more focused on, meetups or preschool immersion, or even dual language schools, which are certainly starting to to grow in number here in Texas and other sort of border states. Those are big decisions to send a child to, either immersion school or to a dual language school.
Yeah.
But sort of a more convenient solution that could start kids, affordably to develop the sort of foundational familiarity in that particular language, in something that was engaging to the child. That really didn't exist. So we believe that there's a sort of a world or a holistic approach to language learning, and everything supportive. But in terms of something that was, accessible, convenient, engaging, and sort of at the ready, we couldn't find anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the two of you also have pretty deep experience in kind of starting up businesses, right? So this was swimming around in your experience as well.
Yes. I mean, my background for the last 20 years has been to, help build and grow essentially startups in the technology arena. Actually, also renewable energies. I did a bit of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always really been interested in businesses that have a social impact of one way or another. And so, that's the other thing that we think is really important about learning a second language. There's so many benefits to learning a second language. Leslie spoke, more specifically around sort of the personal, academic and professional benefits. But what she didn't talk about is how the ways in which it had affected her, EQ.
Yep.
She's, in the kind of diversity that she's been exposed to, and the ability to develop, perspective, and really empathy. And I mean, I'll let Leslie talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's kind of maybe one of the unsung, but really fundamental benefits of learning a second language for anyone, but in particular for children.
Mm-hmm.
And really, it's because of the empathy piece is just huge. And I know it sounds a little bit woo-woo, and it sounds like you're talking about a way bigger thing than it is. But it really, I think it really is. It's very true, and it's very real. And to me, it's like the most important reason that I'm teaching my kids a second language, apart from the opportunities it might bring them. And really, it comes about because of the following. So if you speak two languages as a kid, like I'm right now, you can't see me because we're on a podcast, but I'm holding a glass. I call it a glass. In English, that's what we call it. But any child who's might be as young as 2 years old, who speaks a second language, knows that same object is also called vaso.
Mm.
And so what they know at a very young age, even if they can't verbalize it and they can't put, talk about it, they know that this object can be referred to in two different ways. They understand the concept that there are two different perspectives on the same thing. And that is a huge cognitive lift. That is something that normally happens much later on, the idea that the understanding that there are different perspectives on the same thing.
Right.
And that you can shift from one perspective to the other. And so that you're getting, when you're speaking a second language, you're getting a lot of repetitions with that changing of perspective all the time. And that cements neural pathways. And that is the basis of empathy, right? You cannot
Absolutely.
even start to foster empathy without an understanding that somebody else might have a different perspective. So it is fundamental, and these kids grow up knowing this intuitively and deeply, that there are more than one perspective on the world. And that's the basis of empathy. So really, you're really just doing a lot of reps, so to speak, with the empathy muscles of your mind when you are learning a second language as a child. And I think that stands to benefit the whole of society, right? If we raise kids that have got more empathy as their very in their very essence, in their very heart.
Absolutely. So then, you've got all these realizations of the benefits of the method. How do you then bring it to life? Like, how do you make a product out of this or a service out of this? What's that look like?
Well, one of the things we learned, and I'll refer again to that customer discovery study, you know how important it is to speak to your customers or potential customers and hear what they have to say. One of the things we learned is that it was really important to parents that that whatever solution they were going to use to teach their kids a second language, that it didn't feel like homework, and it wasn't hard work, that it was fun, that it was engaging, that it was that's something that they were eager to do. And so with that, we recognized that we needed to spend time building the appropriate amount of interactivity and engagement into the product. And so, the idea of just taking an illustrated children's book and PDFing it and calling it a sort of a digital story with a narrator was not what we had in mind. That would have been a very flat, and unfortunately, it's an overused sort of way of bringing children's literature to a digital environment. Now, our idea was that we wanted to sort of create a highly interactive, language learning asset. Really, it stands at the intersection of learning and entertainment and games and all of the things that kids love. And of course, we all know how kids are attracted to technology and devices in general. So we spent time building a team that had game development background, casual and MMO games, believe it or not. They were all very keen around our mission. They are missionaries. They're excited about language, and they wanted to make each one of these stories in our platform overall something that kids would be, excited to play with. So, we talk about playing with our story instead of just, reading or consuming or following along.
Right.
Yeah. And so as a result, we've developed sort of a gamified approach that, is largely, we try to very focus on intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. We're trying to inspire the kids to be proud and love the learning that's happening. We ended up developing, multiple modes and ways to go through the story. We've got, stickers as rewards for completing stories. We decided to introduce a mode in which the child practices pronunciation. And then evaluates themselves rather than having some sort of, way to sort of judge or gauge their own pronunciation. So it's fun. It's fun.
It's kind of interesting on that front. You were talking about earlier on about meeting the child where there are, sounds like, maybe there's a Montessori, background there.
Sure.
We've raised both our kids in Montessori schools, and weirdly enough, I think that's kind of informed a fairly large amount of the philosophy, because I guess we've been steeped in it. But what the point Mark is making right there, that kids checking their own work is a really important one, because we don't feel that you need technology to say, you pronounce that wrong.
Right.
Because the human ear, when you play back your version and the original narrators, we all know. Like, kids know. And in actual fact, you don't want to make them feel bad about the fact that they got it wrong. The next time around, they all just automatically lean in a bit more and try and make it a little bit more like the narrator. And so it's a natural process without any rights or wrongs. And so you're letting the kid make their own evaluation as to, how close they got and how close they're going to get next time. It's kind of interesting.
So mechanically, it's the application is sort of replicating, Leslie, that method that you developed of the simultaneous translation. And then is it asking the child to repeat back to the application, the story itself?
Yes, there's we have essentially 5 modes, which are progressively more challenging for each story. The first mode, the narrator reads the story with this simultaneous translation that we referred to earlier. The second mode is when the story is narrated completely in Spanish. And of course, each one of these pages has certain interactive elements to it.
Mm-hmm.
The third mode is where the child essentially copycats the narrator on a phrase-by-phrase basis, and is able to sort of record their voice by sort of pressing the button and having it recorded and then played back, which they absolutely love. Another mode is our games, comprehension games, which test retention of not only some of the vocabulary that they've been exposed to, but also tests some sort of grammatical elements, such as masculine, feminine, singular, plural. And then the final mode is where in this most challenging mode, if you get there, you become the narrator yourself, and you actually are able to record the entire story, go through the story, and then at the end have the entire story read back in your own voice, which is extraordinarily gratifying to kids that can make it that far, and gratifying to their parents who've witnessed this. So,
sure.
Yeah, it's super cool, and we are the beneficiaries of the evolution of both the technology and the penetration of devices, because this is a mobile first application.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the building blocks that we're using is is Unity, which has been traditionally built and used for game development. So this is something that would not have been possible 5 years ago, I believe. So that's the other I think trend that we're I hope to be sort of benefiting from moving forward.
Yeah, and as I'm thinking about that, it's this interesting market where I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about how you relate to entities that could be considered competition or could be considered complement. So, the school system is one, but then these other content delivery platforms, like Netflix, Amazon Prime, et cetera, they could either grab what you're doing and scale it, or replicate it themselves, or you could be important collaborators. Like they could deliver your product. How are you thinking about the landscape of competition and collaboration?
So I think that's a really great question. We really come from a perspective that the more you do to learn a language, the better.
Sure.
So, hey, we have a rule at home that if you want to watch Netflix, it's in Spanish. Period.
Okay.
Right. So, and my kids know that there might've been resistance at the beginning. There isn't anymore. So, watching foreign language films is an awesome way to get more exposure, more comprehensible input, so long as you understand what's going on. So, the subtitles help for that. In terms of other digital products, when we speak to a lot of publishers, I've been on road trips around Spain and South America, speaking to publishers to get more content for the future. And one of the things we say is, they don't see us as a competition to what they do, because at no point do we ever put out a book out there that is a digital book that you can download, take home, and you're going to pay X amount for it. We are a subscription product, and people only come to us to learn a second language. They don't come to download a specific book and then kind of walk away.
Right.
So we very, very much collaborate with publishers, both digital and otherwise, that want to just have a different income stream, for their assets.
Although at the same time, could you also be a publisher as well? Like, are you soliciting content contributors?
We are.
Yeah.
We are, and we do, and definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, Justin. We're essentially a platform, right?
Yeah.
So our content, our stories, have been sourced from freelance writers and illustrators in Latin America that we've hustled to make contacts with, and they've been we've been fortunate that they've been willing to take the risk with us to get this platform going.
Sure.
And essentially it's a licensing arrangement, but we own that particular content. And now we're starting to have conversations with publishers who wouldn't speak to us before, but now that our product is up and running and they've seen the prototype and they're excited about what we're doing, they have, of course, a giant catalog of stories that they are making available for us to sort of repurpose and for them to monetize into these interactive language learning assets. We have to do quite a bit of production or development work on our end to turn their stories into these products. But what we're also doing is we're building the tech to make this process more and more efficient. And ultimately, what we'd like to be is a platform that essentially sits in between the storytellers of the world and the language learners, where the tools that we build and develop are useful in creating and producing, and then ultimately publishing and monetizing the stories that are brought to us. So we'll have a curated collection of stories that we believe are a great fit for our customer base. And of course, as we evolve and as we grow, we're going to get better at understanding what our customers like and want.
Sure.
And we'll be able to implement adaptive learning techniques and content recommendation and things like that. But so that's the longer term vision.
Yeah. So putting this all together, where are you at right now? And can people subscribe, download this thing, or like how far? Where are you at in the process?
Yeah, sure. So we're now sort of 2 years in, and we raised a little outside capital for the first time in about 3 or 4 months ago.
Okay.
Which gives us a nice runway and has allowed us to sort of launch a little quicker than we'd thought.
Mm-hmm.
So we, as of this week, are now live and available on both the App Store and Google Play Store for download. And we have a sort of a freemium model in the sense that the download is free, and then one of our stories is available for free. And then if you want access to the other stories that are in our Fabulingua world, then you would subscribe to our platform. And we will be adding new stories, new features, new games on a regular basis to keep the experience as fresh as possible and to continue to add value to our subscribers. And also to continue to develop their proficiency in the language. And right now we're focused on teaching Spanish to English speakers, but in 2020, at some point, we will be flipping that around and taking these same stories and assets, or a lot of the same stories and assets, and repurposing them to teach English to Spanish speakers, and then we'll go to other languages from there. So that's where we are.
The scale opportunities seem super clear. And I realized that we've been talking about this thing for 40 or so minutes, and that was the first time, Mark, that we've said the name of the business. How is it spelled? And more specifically, like so search on Fabulingua. How do we spell that?
Sure. Search Fabulingua is F as in Frank, Fabu like fabulous, and then lingua like Lingua. So Fabulingua, Fabulingua. And we are at fabulingua.com. We're at Fabulingua on Facebook. We are Fabulingua Kids on Instagram. And you can find us in the App Store and Google Play Store by searching for Fabulingua language learning for kids. And it's a really exciting time for us right now, and hopefully the first step of a long journey.
Yeah, and so I want to be respectful of your time, but before we close, I would love to know, just as a kind of an aside. This is a special business in the sense that it came out of your experience with your children and teaching your own children, and now it's the startup that the two of you have created together.
It's our third baby.
Yeah. So how's that been? Like working on a startup as a married couple? How's that? And parents? How's that coming together?
It's been amazing.
Leslie is very candid about this. I'll let her answer.
It's been amazing and totally exceeded my expectations in any way that I could have thought. And if you'd asked me, 3 years ago whether this would have been a good idea, I would have given you a resounding no. In that, to a certain extent, Mark and I had similar skill sets. I think maybe for any other business, we would have stepped on each other's toes. But for this business in particular, I am so obsessed with the content procurement and the product. And those are, and I'm so, I just don't have time or interest, to be quite honest, to do anything other than that.
Okay.
So, and yet all of that needs to be done. Because in actual fact, I'd started this business for a while before Mark joined. But I realized, I was like, I need somebody else that's just going to, run all of this giant lift that also needs to be happening, as well as procuring all this amount of content, talking to illustrators and authors, and crafting the product and all that kind of stuff. And so really, we're super complementary in this particular business. So it's worked really great. And it's been really wonderful for us to be working at the same time and raising our kids at the same time, because it's become this really easy flow. Oh, have you got the kids today? Yes, I have, because I know what you're working on, all of that kind of stuff. It's been great.
Yeah, I mean, if I could add, I would just say that, we have done a lot of projects together since we've been a couple. So, and we've lived in a lot of places, and we've faced, different seemingly challenging circumstances and situations. And so I think that the sort of scar tissue that we developed from those experiences certainly benefits our partnership now. In the sense that where the openness and the honesty that is required from co-founders and the candor that's required from co-founders is something that comes very natural for us. And the trust that's run is something that comes very natural to us.
Totally. The trust is just gigantic.
Of course.
I'm just not, I think it would have been really hard for me to just turn around to somebody else and go, hey, take half the business.
Right.
This was my baby, but I trust Mark to help me raise my kids. So, I felt totally like I could trust him to help me create this third baby.
Well, the whole story is fantastic. I love the origin. I love the dynamics of the business, how it's using technology to think about how we can deliver education in a different way. And I just wish you two the best of luck. I hope this thing takes off. I'm confident that it will. And I hope that we can talk down the road and check in about how Fabulingua is doing.
Thank you, Justin.
So much.
We really appreciate it.
All right. I learned a ton in that one, and I hope that you did too. It's great to see people thinking about education in new and exciting ways. Note that Mark and Leslie have made their full platform available for free during this coronavirus crisis when families are focused on trying to learn and teach from home. Give it a try. Now's the time. Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. And we're coming to you from Studio 49, a gift from University of Montana alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. And remember that A New Angle is supported by CED, Consolidated Electrical Distributors. These guys pretty much sell anything electrical you would ever need, but they also hire a ton of our students. If you want to learn more about jobs at CED, visit cedcareers.com. Before we go, I want to thank some important peeps, executive producer Stefan Borsum, and interns Aspen Runkle and Max Gibson. Huge thanks to VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks for the tunes, and finally, props to Jeff Meese, our master of all things sound. Finally, if you have any questions, suggestions, comments, insults, whatever, please email me at anewangle@umontana.edu. Help us spread the word, and be sure to use the hashtag #anewangle when you do. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.